When police officers responded to reports of an armed intruder at the home of a wealthy family in Beverly Hills, they did not expect to find the bloodbath that they did. Inside the 9,000 square foot home, authorities found 2 deceased bodies. The scene was gruesome. Both José Menendez and his wife Kitty had been shot numerous times with a shotgun. For months, investigators suspected that organised crime was linked to the murders due to the brutality and José's status as a tough businessman. But in 1990, recordings with their psychologist revealed that it was José and Kitty's 2 sons who were responsible for the horrific slayings. After their confessions in therapy, they were arrested and charged with their parents' murder, with police alleging that the wealthy couple were killed for the money. But not all was as it seemed, as what unfolded during their first trial was a tale of harrowing abuse and desperation to escape a nightmarish situation. Join us for this documentary as we examine a family in turmoil, the brutal case of the Menendez brothers. José Menendez was born on May 6, 1944 in Havana, Cuba, where he spent the bulk of his youth. It wasn't until he was 16 and the Cuban Revolution was starting to take place that he moved to the US to live with distant relatives in Pennsylvania. After earning a swimming scholarship, José attended Southern Illinois University, where he met Mary Louise Kitty Anderson, and a whirlwind romance ensued. The pair hit it off quickly and began spending all of their time together, and then on July 8, 1963, they tied the knot. According to José, his family weren't immediately supportive of his choice, but he dismissed their concerns, stating, "If I'm old enough to live on my own at 16, I'm old enough to get married at 19. At the end of the summer, the couple moved to New York, where José enrolled in Queens College and earned multiple degrees in economics and accounting. They spent a brief period of time in Illinois, but returned to New York in 1968, where Kitty gave birth to the couple's first child, Joseph Lyle, on January 10th that year. Afterwards, Kitty quit her teaching job to become a housemaker, and the family moved to New Jersey. Their second son, Eric Galen, was born on November 27th, 1970. Lyle and Eric grew up in Hopewell Township and attended Princeton Day School, a private and prestigious establishment located in the wealthy borough of Princeton, Mercer County, New Jersey. During the 1980s, José's success in life grew as he rose through the ranks at the likes of Hertz Corporation, the rental car company, and later RCA Records, a label owned by Sony Entertainment. At this latter job, he signed and worked with bands like Duran Duran and Eurythmics, eventually earning the title of Chief Operating Officer, giving him an income of $500,000 a year. As children, Eric and Lyle appeared to want for nothing. At the urging of their father, they began practicing sports, and when they were ages 9 and 12, he forced them to choose one particular activity to concentrate on. Both of the boys picked tennis, which was reportedly their father's preference, and they continued with strict training regimes even into their teen years. Eric later noted, "We are prototypes of my father. He wanted us to be exactly like him." As well as putting an emphasis on sports skills, José was keen for his children to be academically gifted too. He reportedly gave them motivational books from which they were to recite lines, and he phoned them as much as 5 times a day to check on how things were progressing with their homework, classwork or tennis practice. Later, in 1989, Lyle observed, "My father suffered from being a perfectionist. It carried over into his home life, and it was sometimes difficult for Eric and me. So much so that if he really couldn't do something well enough, it wore on him tremendously mentally, and it wore on us." In a similar vein, those who knew Kitty and José remarked that they were a couple who were very concerned about their family's public image. They sought to look like a perfect unit on the outside and push their children to reach for success, even if things were very different behind closed doors. In 1986, the family moved across the country from New Jersey to Southern California after José took a new job running the home video division of Carolco Pictures in LA. The family's new home was 8,000 square feet on almost 14 acres of land in Calabasas. But although José was seeing nothing but success, his wife Kitty struggled with the adjustment. She considered the move to the West Coast devastating. Furthermore, during their marriage, José was flagrantly unfaithful to her, and she was again devastated by his infidelity. Her former therapist would later testify during the first Menendez Brothers trial that Kitty was suicidal at one point after she discovered that while they'd been living in New York, her husband had carried out an affair for 8 years. Later reports noted that while José was controlling and demanding, Kitty suffered from depression, alcoholism, and drug addiction. Following the move, Eric began attending Calabasas High School. Lyle, almost 3 years older, remained in Princeton, where he began taking classes at Princeton University. He was reportedly rejected from the school after graduating high school, but reapplied at the urging of his father, who dreamt of his eldest attending an Ivy League establishment. His second application was accepted, in large part because of his skills as a tennis player, as opposed to his academic talents, and it soon showed, as Lyle reportedly struggled to adjust to the academic rigor and the expectations the school had for him. Still, by all accounts, he did his best to pass his classes, although his grades were known to be average at best. Before long, things began to fall apart for Lyle, however, as during his first semester he was accused of plagiarism. He is said to have copied his lab partner's homework during a psychology class and attempted to claim it as his own. As a result of the allegations, Lyle was subject to a 4-hour hearing, after which the disciplinary committee deliberated for an hour before returning with 2 options for the 19-year-old. He could either take a 1-year suspension or be expelled entirely. Lyle chose the former. When José found out about this, he tried to appeal to the university to have his son reinstated, but the decision had been made and the school would not budge. This wasn't the only thing plaguing the Menendez family at this time, however. While both in California, Lyle and Eric soon became involved with a group of privileged teen boys who were suspected of burglarizing homes in the area for fun. Eric was eventually implicated in at least 2 thefts in which more than $100,000 in money and jewels were stolen. Just days after he was charged with burglary, his father recovered the vast majority of the stolen items and turned them into the sheriff's department. José also wrote a check for $11,000 to cover the expensive items that were not found. As a consequence of his actions, Eric was given probation, community service, and compulsory counseling. His mother, Kitty, was seeing a psychiatrist at the time and asked for a recommendation for her youngest son so that she could set him up in therapy. Shortly afterwards, Eric began seeing psychologist Jerome Oziel. Another notable action of Eric's during this time was that he wrote a screenplay which he named Friends. The piece tells the story of a wealthy young man whose story starts with him killing his parents for the inheritance money. Following the arrest of the Menendez brothers in 1990, many pointed to this piece of fiction as evidence of the motive behind the killings. In 2017, ABC News spoke with Craig Signorelli, Eric's friend and classmate who wrote the screenplay with him. Craig recalled, "I remember talking about the opening scene, in just the idea of, we need to establish a crime. We need to have the protagonist gain an inheritance so he can actually fulfill his dream of creating this hunting ground for humans." The two boys wrote that the main character, an 18-year-old named Hamilton Cromwell, whom they described as being sophisticated, good-looking, starts the story by reading about the money his father intended to leave him upon his death. Hamilton then enters his parents' bedroom at night with sinister intentions. By Craig's account, the main plot of the story is not that a young man kills his parents for money. They simply needed a way for their character to inherit money which would allow him to do what the story required him to do. Craig stated, "I guess there's 3 ways to do it. You're either going to win the lottery, you're going to work very, very hard for 1 year, and from 18 to 19 you're going to earn $100 million, or you're going to have to find a way to inherit it. And for us, the only option aside from winning the lottery, realistically, was to do an inheritance, and so that was set as the basic scene." In 1988, following Eric's first brush with the law, José decided to move the family again. This time they settled in Beverly Hills, where they lived in a 9,000 square foot, 6-bedroom home on Elm Drive with a private pool and tennis court. Although Lyle eventually returned to Princeton University in 1989 following his 1-year suspension, academic success remained out of reach. Reportedly, he hated the university and talked about transferring elsewhere, adding that he was only there because it was what his parents wanted and expected of him. His girlfriend later introduced him to Donovan Goodrew, a young man who soon became Lyle's best friend at the school. According to media reports, Donovan was willing to write Lyle's essays for him so that he could continue at Princeton, but his class grades remained low, leading to academic disciplinary action. He ultimately withdrew from Princeton in late 1989 following the murder of his parents. By the spring of 1989, Kitty's brother reported that José had grown tired of his children's failures to make something of themselves. Between Lyle struggling to excel at Princeton and Eric becoming entangled with crime several years later, the boys were not meeting his stringent expectations for them. It was around this time that José alluded to cutting his children out of his will. Reflecting on his difficult relationship with their father, Eric later stated that it was brutal, painful, torturous, and yet I admired him because he was so strong and he was everything that success was, that I was taught that success was. On August 20th, 1989, 45-year-old José and 47-year-old Kitty were shot and killed in the den of their home in Beverly Hills. José had been shot at point-blank range in the back of the head and then hit 3 more times in the limbs. Kitty, meanwhile, was shot 4 times in the head and 5 times across the body. Some reports note that the mother of 2 was trying to crawl away before the fatal shots was fired. It would later transpire that 2 days earlier, Eric and Lyle had visited several gun stores in the hopes of securing handguns. However, due to the 2-week waiting period mandated by gun laws, the 2 purchased shotguns instead, along with several boxes of ammunition. A neighbor recalled hearing the distant string of popping sounds going off in the area that night, but stated, "I didn't think anything of it. I didn't even think it could be gunfire, especially around here." After killing their parents, the Menendez brothers collected shell casings left behind by their weapons before leaving the residence. They had fully expected the police to immediately arrive on the scene and were surprised when no police showed up as they tried to clean up. After leaving their parents' house, they disposed of their blood-stained clothing and buried their weapons somewhere along Mulholland Drive. Next, they headed to the cinema to get tickets for Batman, which they planned to use as their alibi, but they abandoned this plan due to the timestamp on the tickets and headed to the Taste of LA Festival at Santa Monica Civic Auditorium instead. About an hour and a half later, 911 operators received a distraught phone call from a young man identifying himself as 21-year-old Lyle Menendez. He sobbed, "They shot and killed my parents." He claimed that he and Eric had just returned home to find their parents deceased in the house. As police arrived, Eric, now 18, was said to have screamed while curled up in a ball on the grass, sobbing. The The police officers responding to the scene did not expect the gruesome bloodbath they uncovered inside. Beverly Hills Police Detective Leslie Zuela said, "Kitty was wearing white. She was covered in blood. José had a shotgun blast to the back of his head. Blood everywhere. It was really horrendous." Forensic experts recalled the crime scene as being the most brutal one they had ever worked on, remembering the blood and brain matter splattered throughout the room. Retired Beverly Hills detective Dan Stewart added, "Blood, flesh, skulls. It would be hard to describe, especially José, as resembling a human that you would recognize. That's how bad it was." The shotgun blast to José's head had led to a deformity of the face. The Menendez brothers held firm under questioning by the police. They said that on the night of the murders, they'd gone to see License to Kill, the latest James Bond flick, but found that the lines were too long, so they opted to see the newest Batman instead. They then went to the Taste of LA festival and claimed that they tried to reach a friend they'd planned to meet later that day, but were unable to do so. Thus, they eventually returned home. They alleged that the driveway gate was unlocked and the front door was open when they got back. Investigators initially suspected that there was some sort of organised crime involvement due to the brutal and violent nature of the deaths. A former Live executive recalled that José was by far the brightest, toughest businessman I have ever worked with. He was always ahead of the competition. After joining Carolco Pictures, the father of two showed his ruthlessness by immediately cutting 383 jobs and closing the company's pricey office in Woodland Hills, California. The business had lost $20 million in 1986, but under José's leadership, it soon began to thrive, earning $8 million in 1987 and twice that in 1988. During his extensive career, José made connections with all sorts, including Sylvester Stallone, who sat on the board at Carolco Pictures, and musicians Barry Manilow and Rick Springfield. He also brushed shoulders with less savoury characters. According to People.com, in 1986, Carolco Pictures began to acquire IVE, short for International Video Entertainment, a separate company. At the time, IVE was owned by Noel Bloom, who has been described as a distributor of X-rated movies and at one point had ties to the mob. Though the deal was done before José joined Carolco, he still had dealings with Bloom, who claimed that he was owed $500,000. The issue eventually wound up in court, with Carolco settling. Another deal saw Beck Zack Corp, which owned 80 audio video stores, be bought over. Its owner, Morris Levy, was convicted in 1988 after he conspired to extort payments from a record wholesaler. These shady business dealings led investigators to speculate that there was some connection between them and the death of José and his wife. However, the deepest of background checks found absolutely nothing that could point police in the direction of a suspect. It didn't seem that José's work was the reason for his demise after all. It wasn't long before investigators turned their attention to the Menendez brothers, who had recently received a $400,000 insurance payout following the deaths of their parents. In the autumn of 1989, Lyle began spending lavishly, purchasing a Porsche Carrera, a $15,000 Rolex watch, and a haul of clothing from an upscale clothing store, including 5 silk shirts, which were $90 apiece. The total haul came to about $600, with an employee of the clothing store Lyle visited noting, "We've had bigger sales, but not in 4 minutes." Seeming to now feel free of his parents' expectations and plans for him, Lyle dropped out of Princeton and began to scour local businesses, looking for one to purchase. In January of 1990, he bought Chuck Spring Street Cafe, a popular student hangout, for over $500,000. The restaurant's manager, Gus Tangalos, recalled that Lyle was incredibly hardworking and devoted the bulk of his time to the business. One day, the young man showed up and began stirring chicken wing sauce without even changing out of his pricey outfit. Gus recalled, "I said, 'Boss, why are you doing that?' And he said, 'We've got to take care of the people. We can't have them waiting in line too long.' That's what I call an aggressive businessman." Since the restaurant was best known for its buffalo wings, Lyle eventually renamed the establishment Mr. Buffalo's. He made plans to re-coordinate it with a Western theme and wanted to open up more restaurants in other locations like California. He dreamt of becoming a proper businessman and making money in real estate, and set up Menendez Investment Enterprises, a corporate shell company that he planned to inject cash into after receiving his inheritance. His first employee was fellow Princeton student 20-year-old David Rose, who was brought on as a consultant. David later claimed that he'd done his own research into Lyle and his brother, but noted that there was nothing really interesting in their backgrounds. He stated, "For someone to commit a crime like this, I saw no psychological leads. I'm not standing by his word, I'm standing by my own research." Eric, meanwhile, had his own lofty ambitions. He wished to enter the world of politics, but despite all of these dreams, Eric did not enter the political sphere right away. Instead, he turned his attention to tennis. Initially, he'd planned to attend UCLA after graduating. He had reportedly wanted to move away from his parents, but his father would not support the decision. However, following the murder of his parents, Eric instead hired a full-time tennis coach and began to improve his skills. A family friend recalled that Eric was never good enough at tennis to become a serious player, believing he turned to the sport as an emotional escape. But despite this, he travelled to Israel in early 1990 to compete in a series of games, eventually losing the first round in both of the tournaments he participated in. The brothers opted not to reside in their parents' Beverly Hills mansion following their deaths. Instead, they began living in adjoining condominiums in the seaside community of Marina del Rey. As well as being busy with their respective ambitions, Lyle and Eric travelled frequently, visiting the UK and the Caribbean, and dining out at expensive, exclusive restaurants. Before their arrest in 1990, the two spent about $700,000, although family members noted that this wasn't unusual and that they'd spent handsomely before the deaths of their parents too. Shortly before their arrest, Craig Signorelli, the same friend of Eric's who'd written the screenplay with him, came forward to the police to tell them that Eric had confessed to the murders. According to the LA Times, Craig stated that he visited Eric a few days after the deaths of Kitty and José. Eric looked at me and just kind of relaxed and said, "Do you want to know what happened?" Eric reportedly told him that the two returned home so that he could pick up a fake ID to go to the bar. But when he came out of the house, Lyle was clutching the two shotguns. According to Craig, Lyle said, "Let's do it." Eric then followed his brother's instructions, shooting their mother as she stood up from the sofa. Craig added that he didn't know whether or not he would turn his best friend in after hearing all of this, but eventually he decided he would. Police soon arranged for Craig to wear a wire in order to record a confession from Eric, but when Craig asked if he'd killed his parents, Eric said he hadn't. Eventually, however, it all came to light when Eric confessed to his longtime psychologist, Jerome Oziel, who subsequently told his girlfriend, Judalyn Smythe. As a result of the confession, Oziel began recording his sessions with the brothers, and shortly afterwards, following her breakup with Oziel, Judalyn told the police what she knew. Lyle was arrested on March the 8th, 1990, outside of the family home, while Eric turned himself in 3 days later after returning home from the tennis tournament in Israel. There was some delay in starting the Menendez brothers' first trial due to an appeal that was filed after it was decided that the recorded conversations between Eric and his therapist were admissible in court. In 1992, it was deemed that most of the tapes were admissible, except for the one in which Eric discussed the murders. Following this, in December of that same year, the two brothers were charged with first-degree murders of their parents. Though the prosecution had attempted to add special circumstances to the changes, which was that the murders had been carried out for financial gain, This was determined to be unsupported by the evidence and was ultimately excluded from the charges, though new special circumstances that they were lying in wait was added instead, making them eligible for the death penalty. The first trial began on July 20th, 1993. Though the brothers were tried together, separate juries would be making the decisions at the end of it. The two were represented by Leslie Abramson and Jill Lansing, and the story that they told while on trial was completely unexpected, tragic, and a shock to many, but not to all. Lyle and Eric tested that they had killed their parents after suffering a lifetime of abuse at their hands, with their father, José, being the worst of the two. Not just a tough, critical perfectionist, the brothers accused their father of being a paedophile who'd molested Lyle in his childhood, between the ages of 6 and 8. Eric, meanwhile, claimed that the abuse started when he was 6 years old, but never ended. Much later, in 2017, Eric was interviewed for the docuseries The Menendez Murders. Eric tells all. During this time, he shared some of the horrific details of his encounters with his father, stating, "He would have me massage him and he would have me perform oral sex on him. He would graphically describe to me how he would kill me if I ran away." Lyle stated during the trial that he had once confronted his father about what he suspected he was doing to his younger brother when he was 13 years old, which would have made Eric around the age of 10. Eric, meanwhile, explained that at one point, when he was 17, he'd attempted to refuse his father's advances, and José had responded by putting a knife to his throat. During the trial, the defense presented several photographs of baby boys taken from the waist down. Lyle alleged that the pictures had been taken by their father, though the prosecution argued that there was no evidence to support this. But it wasn't just Lyle and Eric who talked about the abuse they suffered at the hands of their father. It seemed that the molestation of the pair was heavily suspected by many members of the family, who came forward to support the brothers' story. The pair's cousin, Diane Vandermolen, testified that in the mid-1970s, while she was staying with the family, Lyle had told her what was happening to him. When Diane then told Kitty about the confession, Kitty defended José and accused her own son of lying. Afterwards, Kitty sent Lyle upstairs, and Diane never heard the issue being discussed again. Another cousin, Andy Kano, remembered that when he was a child, Eric had told him about the abuse, which they both described as genital massages. A third cousin, Alan Anderson, later told 48 Hours that while he'd never seen or been told about the abuse, he'd noticed that while growing up with Lyle and Eric, there were plenty of occasions when José would shower with the two young boys or take one of them off to a bedroom for one-on-one time. Alan added that Kitty would never let him go near that floor of the home when it was happening. According to Eric, his brother did not know that the abuse was still ongoing until he confessed as much to him, just weeks before the murders. Tensions rose in the house during this time, as José had allegedly threatened the two boys numerous times with death if they told anybody what was going on. In the days leading up to August 20th, 1989, the friction continued to build, to the point that the two young men believed that their parents might try to kill them because the brothers wanted to expose what was happening, so they purchased shotguns for what they said was self-defense. The two told the court that on the night of August 20th, José had closed the door to the den, where he and their mother were watching television. This was, according to the brothers, unusual. They began to suspect that their parents were plotting their deaths, and so the two went out to load up their shotguns. Eric stated, "As I went into the room, I just started firing." The prosecution, meanwhile, argued that the real reason the two had killed their parents were because they were afraid they were about to be disinherited. A friend of Lyle's told investigators that the 21-year-old, a week after the murders, had returned to California from Princeton to destroy something on the family computer. They stated that Lyle had confessed it was a new will of his father's. A computer expert also alleged that they'd been hired by Lyle to erase all traces of the will. The prosecution also claimed that Eric Menendez was confused about his sexual orientation at the time of the killings, and that was another reason why the parents had to be murdered, because tensions were rising around whether Eric was heterosexual or not. Eric reportedly did testify that he was real confused about his sexual identity and claimed that his father called him a homosexual slur and his mother gave him a deadline by which he was to get himself a girlfriend. However, he stated that the abuse at the hands of his father is what led him to become confused about how he identified. He added that his mother had made it sound worse than death to be gay. The prosecution also presented the audio recordings between Eric and his therapist as evidence in court. On the tapes, the brothers made no mention of their father's abuse, but spoke openly about his controlling ways. They also referred to their mother as suicidal, something that Kitty's former therapist backed up during the trial. Jerome Oziel told the court that he didn't believe the Menendez brothers killed for money, instead arguing that they killed out of hatred and out of a desire to be free from their father's domination, message of inadequacy and impossible standards. The tapes also heard Lyle state that killing their mother might have been doing her a favour, putting her out of her misery. However, the defence claimed that Oziel was being manipulative and controlling of the brothers' narratives by directing the statements they were making. His ex-girlfriend, Judalon Smythe, agreed with this sentiment, testifying that Oziel wished to control the pair by taping their sessions. Despite their best efforts of the prosecution and the defence, a mistrial was ultimately declared when the juries were unable to agree on a verdict. Reportedly, both juries were divided by gender, with women pushing for voluntary manslaughter and men pushing for first-degree murder. Since neither side would move, a mistrial was announced and a second trial was scheduled for 1995. In October 1995, the second trial started, but things were a little bit different this time around, as only one jury was used, and Lyle refused to testify as the defense worried he may perjure himself. Notably, Lyle had reportedly written to an ex-girlfriend during the first trial to instruct her on how to testify. Furthermore, prosecution, led by David Conn, successfully objected to a large swath of defense evidence, most of which pertained to the abuse the brothers had suffered at the hands of their father. The prosecution referred to the argument that the brothers had killed in response to the abuse as the abuse excuse, and alleged that the pair were lying about what they'd endured. The same judge, Stanley Weisberg, who'd overseen the first trial, also oversaw the second. The prosecution did their best to vilify the brothers as much as possible, showing autopsy photos and crime scene images, and alleging that they were motivated purely by greed, while the defense argued that the two were victims of a system that did not take abuse allegations seriously, particularly those involving boys and men. Eric's lawyer, Leslie Abramson, who returned for the second trial, argued that the pair had killed out of mind-numbing, adrenaline-pumping fear, stating that the defense will prove to you that Eric was tortured, terrorized, exploited, molested and abused to such a state he lived in a constant state of fear. The prosecution claimed that Eric was a legal adult and had a car. There was no reason why he couldn't have left home to escape his father's wrath. When asked why he didn't simply join the army, Eric replied that he didn't believe it would have protected him because he viewed his father as the most powerful man I've ever met. Eric also admitted that he knew he'd been written out of his father's will because José had told him as much. Reportedly, José had said it was because his son was not living up to his expectations. One notable witness for the prosecution was Lyle's ex-girlfriend, Jamie Pisarcik, who said that Lyle had initially told her stories about how the mob had killed his parents. While she initially believed his words, at some point she stopped, and Lyle attempted to bribe her into falsely testifying during the trial. She also said that during a visit to Lyle in prison, he offered her money to claim that his father had made sexual advances towards her. The prosecution concluded the second trial by claiming that the stories told by the Menendez brothers were the silliest, most ridiculous stories that a court had ever heard. The defense argued that Eric was a sufferer of post-traumatic stress disorder, and that his conviction would be the ultimate tragedy. This time, the prosecution won. Both Lyle and Eric were convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances for lying in wait, as well as conspiracy to murder. They were given life in prison without the possibility of parole. Reflecting in 2024, Lyle stated, "Looking back on the trials, Eric and I and our family thought we were going into a manslaughter case with a district attorney that understood the traumatic impact that sexual violence creates in a person, and we ended up with the same sentence as a serial killer." For over 2 decades, the brothers were imprisoned separately, about 500 miles apart. Eric was sent to Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego County, while Lyle was incarcerated at Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. Though they were apart, they wrote one another regular letters. In 1996, Lyle stated, "Our start to prison life was tremendously painful. My brother actually went on a hunger strike to try to keep us together." It wasn't until 2018 that the pair were reunited, when Lyle was transferred to Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility, with Eric moving into his specific unit shortly afterwards. They reportedly burst into tears when they found themselves face to face again. In July of 1996, Lyle married his first wife, Anna Erickson. The ceremony was attended by Eric's lawyer and their aunt, Marta Menendez. However, the union was short-lived, and in 2001, after 5 years together, the pair divorced as Anna discovered that Lyle was having an affair. In November 2003, he married Rebecca Sneed, a lawyer whom he'd known for around 10 years before their union. Lyle has discussed his need to feel proud of what he is doing with his life, even while behind bars, stating, "Education seemed like an obvious answer to that question." In 2024, he earned a bachelor's degree in sociology through the University of California's college program for inmates. He is currently pursuing a master's degree in urban planning. 6 years earlier, he founded what is described as a prison reform and beautification initiative called the Green Space Project, which he hopes will make prisons a more livable and positive space by planting greenery and painting murals on the walls. Lyle has stated that he is still carrying the guilt over the death of his parents, noting, "This tragedy will always be the most astounding and regrettable thing that has ever happened in my life. You can't escape the memories, and I long ago stopped trying." Meanwhile, Eric also got married. In 1999, he tied the knot with Tammy Ruth Sokoman. In 2005, she self-published a book titled "They Said We'd Never Make It: My Life with Eric Menendez." He says his marriage brings a lot of peace and joy. Eric took up painting while in prison and even gifted a portrait to comedian Kathy Griffin. Reflecting on his time behind bars, he stated, "Being arrested was such a relief. My life was over and I was glad. Once I was arrested and put into prison, the person who I was began to emerge again. I had to find it for myself." He has stated that he, too, feels remorse for the murders, noting, "I wanted to go back in time. I wanted to take everything back that Lyle and I did." A large portion of the brothers' family members still stand by them to this day. Kitty's own sister has stated that she believes the two should have been charged with manslaughter, not first-degree murder. Joan Anderson van der Molen, who is now 92, states that her nephew's actions were tragic, stating they were just children who were brutalized in the most horrific ways. However, at least one relative, Kitty's brother, Milton Anderson, stated that the pair were cold-blooded killers who should stay in prison for their heinous act. He does not believe the brothers' claims of abuse, but believes they were motivated by money. In 2023, a movement in the case began when their lawyers filed a petition with the court in May of that year. The petition cited new allegations that had come out against José from an unrelated party, as well as a newly discovered letter which Eric had written to a cousin 8 months before the murders. The new allegation emerged following the release of the Peacock docuseries Menendez and Menudo, Boys Betrayed. Menudo was a band that José had contact with during his time with RCA Records, and one member, Roy Rosello, had joined the group at the age of 13. At the time of his feature in the docuseries, he was 51, and he alleged that at the age of 14, he was drugged and sexually assaulted by José in his mansion. Roy stated, "I know what he did to me in his house." In the docuseries, he pointed to a photo of José and said, "That's the man here that raped me. That's the paedophile." Meanwhile, the letter was sent to Eric's cousin 8 months before the murders was recovered by José's sister, Marta Cano. It had been sent to her late son, Andy, and read in part, "I've been trying to avoid Dad. It's still happening, Andy, but it's worse for me now. I can't explain it. He is so overweight that I can't stand to see him. I never know when it's going to happen, and it's driving me crazy. Every night I stay up thinking he might come in. I need to put it out of my mind. I know what you said before, but I'm afraid. You just don't know Dad like I do. He's crazy. He's warned me 100 times about telling anyone, especially Lyle." The petition filed by the brothers' lawyers notes that the new evidence not only portrayed José was a violent and abusive man, but it strongly suggests that, in fact, he was still abusing Eric Menendez as late as 1988. It also adds, "Instead, the crime was manslaughter, not murder. The killings occurred in imperfect self-defense after a lifetime of physical and sexual abuse from their parents." The two brothers most recently opened up in a new Netflix documentary simply titled The Menendez Brothers, which was released on October the 7th. In it, Eric discussed how his father loved his children, but he believed that his love needed to be earned. So to be loved by him, we had to be worthy of that love, and often that meant going through pain. Eric also stated that a major misconception about him is that he didn't love his parents. "This is the farthest thing from the truth. I miss my mother tremendously. I wish that I could go back and talk to her and give her a hug and tell her that I love her. And I wanted her to love me and be happy with me, and be happy that I was her son, and feel that joy and that connection. Thinking of his father, however, was much more difficult. I simply idolized him. I wanted to be like him, but he was rarely a dad." As of the writing of this script in late October 2024, there have been no new updates, except that the LA County District Attorney is currently reviewing the new evidence in the case. A court hearing is scheduled for November the 26th.